This is the Prometheus Design Works Invictus SP. And this is an incredibly cool knife that unfortunately kind of sucks as a cutting tool. My goal with this review is to give you everything you need to know to make an informed purchase decision and decide whether this is the right knife for you or not. I'm going to try to do that quickly and concisely, though I'm going to focus on being complete more than being concise. I go through reviews in 5 steps. First, we're going to talk about generally what this knife is, where it comes from, key things that you should know in terms of background and context. Then we'll talk about the blade, then the handle and ergonomics, talk about fit, finish, and value, and then come back for some overall conclusions. So let's get into it. So again, this is the Prometheus Design Works Invictus SP. Brief background on Prometheus Design Works. You've probably seen them as PDW some other places. So they are an offshoot from Patrick Ma. Patrick Ma was one of the founders of Triple Aught Design. In 2013, split with Triple Aught Design over some disagreements about how the business was being run, not worth getting into now. But among other things, he has created Prometheus Design Works, which is basically his new version of Triple Aught Design, sells some apparel and some high-end, hype-driven knives, as well as Terrain 365, which you might have seen is a brand with very similar, often identical designs. And instead of using typical steels, like this one uses MagnaCut or M390, we'll use Terravantium, their proprietary or at least patented dendritic cobalt material. Those Terrain 365 knives are a little bit more unique because of that material. They're totally corrosion resistant, but the fact is, even the stuff in the Prometheus Design Work line really has that kind of techie vibe that Patrick Ma is known for. Very outdoorsy, sort of like the kind of thing that you would see in like a naval base of the future or on some sort of submarine, or, there's just a very sort of sleek, high speed, low drag, but on the high tech of things aesthetic to most everything that Patrick Ma has his hands on. This Invictus profile here, which is really, this fuller here, this spear point blade shape, and then these fullers on the handle. This is a design language that Ma has been using since back in his time at Triple Aught Design. It's something that Triple Aught Design still uses in a lot of their high-end designer collaborations. Many people think that this sort of Invictus platform in its various forms is one of the most distinctive and good-looking knife design languages or sort of core knife designs in the industry. And as I'll get into, it's hard to disagree with that from an aesthetic perspective. This knife here, I cannot actually tell you with 100% certainty the country of origin. What I know is that in the early days of Prometheus Design Works and Terrain 365, some of their stuff was definitely made in the US, or was at least marketed as made in the US. I've bought many Prometheus Design and Terrain 365 knives before. I certainly bought some of them under the belief that they were made in the US. They're certainly all designed in the US. They're designed out here in California. These more modern Invictus models do not say anywhere on the site made in America. They don't say anywhere on the blade made in America. And generally when that is the case, it is not made in America. I'm going to assume this is made by a Chinese OEM. Kind of feels like a Chinese OEM. And you'll see, there's a lot of things that make this quite similar to a lot of other flipper or thumb stud frame locks that you're getting out of places like Best Tech right now. Spec wise, 3.5 inches on the blade here, 8 1/8, so 8.125 inches overall. 120 thousandths on the blade stock. So you might remember me saying this is the Invictus SP. There was originally, and there has been for a while, an Invictus model that both Prometheus Design Work and Terrain 365 have been creating. That has 145 or 150 thousandths blade stock. The handle on this SP is a little bit thinner, but honestly all they've done to thin out the handle is make this flat instead of rounded. The scales are not that much thinner than on the standard model, but they've taken that blade stock from 150 or 145 down to 120. As we'll get into with the blade, that makes a huge difference. And if you want to know about that thicker version, Anthony Scullambrini over at Everyday Commentary did a very in-depth review of the full thickness Invictus not that long ago. I'll spoil it for you and say that he was not a big fan of it, in particular because of the cutting performance on that full thickness blade. This is the slimmer version, does cut better. 3.4 ounces. There is some pretty significant, you won't be able to see it here, but there's some pretty significant internal milling that does lighten it up. Full titanium frame lock, and then let's do some quick size comparisons. This is as a 3.5-inch knife in a pretty typical range that you see. There's your Spyderco PM2, about the same size. Here's the TRM Atom. In fact, a sort of special TRM Atom I'll be talking about in my next video. This is one of the Mike Erie hand ground ones, about the same size as your Atom here. And then if you compare it to, sorry for the bump there, your large Sebenza, it is about the same size and a very similar in profile to your large Sebenza. Milled titanium pocket clip here works just fine. And again, it's a frame lock on bearings with a thumb stud action. And you can see this thumb stud here has a little bit of glowy stuff right there in the top. It's almost certainly not tritium. It's probably the same sort of material that you get in like lume for a watch. Last thing, this is $349 retail. This particular version is sold out just about everywhere, but I believe you can get the Terrain 365 version of these in Terravantium, which is literally the exact same design, just with Magna Cut on the PDW version and Terravantium on the Terrain 365 version. These tend to go for less than retail on the secondary market. I paid significantly less than $350 on the secondary market to get this one, and I will be selling it for significantly less than $350 when I sell it again. So that's your overall specifications of this knife. Let's talk about this blade. Actually, no, I'm going to change my format a little bit, and I'm going to talk about first just the most compelling thing about the knife, because honestly, if you're looking at this, it's probably the reason that you're buying it, and that is the looks. Looks usually aren't something that I talk about in and of themselves, but Patrick Ma is at least from a visual perspective, and frankly in general, but especially from a visual perspective, is a really good knife designer. And this, not only is it a good looking and unique looking knife, there is an insane number of really thoughtful little design cues. This is made by somebody who thinks like a graphic designer, just in the way that everything is put together. First off, you've got the overall profile, and the way that this is designed, you can see it's mostly straight lines. You've got straight lines across the back here. You've got your blade edge parallel to the back of the blade here. You have these fullers throughout, exact same milling radius on this fuller and these fullers. These are all parallel. They reinforce that sort of straight line design. You got a big fat chamfer all the way around the edge, but still your chamfers are parallel. You got a nice little cutout right there that shows a little bit more of the blade. Gives you another straight line there. Also gives you a little bit more push on the jimping. This, the flat here, again, another parallel straight line. Across the back, everything is either a sort of quite rounded curve, or most things are still straight lines. You know, your jimping, pretty much, they look like little oblongs with straight lines across. Straight lines all across the clip here. It's just, and then you look closer and you can see how these chamfers intersect right up front there. How you've got a chamfer here and a chamfer here that intersect in an interesting way there. When you look even at the back spacer, you've got a cutout in the back spacer. Why is that cutout in the back spacer there? Well, that cutout in the back spacer there, so when you fold up the blade can fit all the way into the frame like that, making it not much larger than the handle without running into that back spacer. The way that there's the top of the what's it called, swedge here is parallel to that cutout there, which often isn't the case. The way that swedge comes in, the way the angle of the swedge even, and this whole bead blasted finish makes the swedge sort of counter to the plunge here. It's just the way there's no screws on the show side. The way these fullers sort of merge into that chamfer. The closer you look at this knife, the more thoughtful visual design details you see. There is no facet of this knife, no angle of this knife that was not intensely considered from a visual perspective. Everything about this knife is designed to get a particular aesthetic and to get this particular sort of tactical, high-speed, low drag with a little bit of a nautical vibe look to it. And it absolutely nails it. I mean, this looks like something that you would find on on some sort of Navy boat of the future. Like I said that sort of thing before. It's just, even on the lock side, which is a little bit more cluttered, you still see all those design cues, and they managed to make the clutter make it look even a little bit more sort of tactical. The fact is, most people are looking at and are interested about this knife first and foremost because it looks really cool. It looks cool on the table. It looks cool in your hand. It looks cool when you're using it. It looks cool when it's closed. It looks cool when it's opened. It looks cool on both sides. It just is it looked great in Instagram photos. It is a great looking knife. And frankly, I think this slim profile version with the flat here that gives you another interesting visual facet is even better looking than your standard in full thickness Invictus. So I bring that up first for this knife because this is really a design-driven knife. This is a knife, Spyderco says they make it for the eye, not the hand. This is a knife that is made for the hand, not the eye. This is a knife that is made for the eye, not the hand. And if you're wondering sort of where does this design come from, why is it like this, it's form first. And I think, you look at the way that PDW and Terrain 365 and Triple Aught Design market, especially their knives, they add that tactical aspect to it. But they really do emphasize the looks even a little more overtly, I think, than a lot of other brands do. And that's because they're really nicely designed. They look great. Now onto the function. Let's talk about this blade. First interesting thing about the blade is this finish. This is Magna Cut, and this is actually a blasted finish on the blade. It's, they put some technical terminology on the site. It's like some micro-peened finish. Blasted blades, you don't see them a lot, in large part because if you have a high corrosion steel or an easily corrodable steel, a blasted finish can corrode very easily. Fortunately, you've got Magna Cut here. Corrosion is not an issue. And on the Terrain 365 version, you've got Terravantium, which literally can't rust. So you don't have to worry about your blasted blade rusting here. What you've got instead is a very traditional spear point blade. I mean, this is your tip slightly above your pivot, parallel blade edge and spine right here, a little bit of crowning on the spine on both sides of that swedge. You've got a fuller here that is purely aesthetic. You've got a pretty shallow flat grind. This is a flat grind. And if you look at it, you ignore the fuller, it's full thickness all the way down to here. So you've only got a little bit of space for that edge to drop. You've got some nice jimping back here. And by the way, this is some of the best jimping I've ever felt on a knife. It's relatively shallow, but those edges are sharp. And what it is, the reason it's so good is because if I put light pressure here, my thumb can skate over this jimping really easily. It doesn't get in the way. But if I press down, it will lock me in like the best jimping out there. This is really, really remarkably well done jimping. And part of the reason they do this cutout here is so that when you press down, your thumb can go around that jimping and still have purchase on it. If these shoulders had been pressed out, you wouldn't be able to access that jimping quite as much. Again, another very smart little design decision. Even put chamfers right there just so it was even easier to access. Back to the blade here. So again, pretty shallow flat. And let's get to our cutting performance now. You can see if you look down here, it's not thick behind the edge because you've only got 120 thousandths on the stock, which is thinner than your PM2 or your PM3. It's thinner than your Sabenza, stuff like that. It's not thick stock. The fact is, because of that thin stock, and because it's Magna Cut, which takes an edge very nicely, you can make this cut. I laid this edge back to 17 degrees. There's a 17 degree edge right here because when I got it, I got this secondhand, and honestly, it didn't cut all that well. I don't know if this was a factory edge or an edge the previous owner had put on it, so I resharpened it myself. Now it cuts fine. It is not a great cutter. It's not a great slicer, but it performs well enough that it won't be an issue. And because you've got this super versatile, super basic spear point blade shape, there's honestly not a ton to say about the blade shape It looks really cool. Again, the way you've got these parallel lines with the big fuller there, it just looks awesome, especially in this blasted finish that gives the whole thing this very, very neutral visual feel. It's fine. A spear point like this will be, it's sort of the epitome, kind of like your Chris Reeve drop point. It's kind of like the epitome of a blade shape that is good at everything. It will stab well, it will pierce well, it will slice well, while not being great at anything. You've got a little bit of belly up here, which is great when you need to do slicing cuts, but not that much belly, so it's not great at slicing cuts. You've got a big flat here, so it's easy to press down into stuff, but it's not a huge enough flat that you can use it kind of like a warnie for utility cuts. You've got a relatively high tip, but not a super high tip. So, you know, it's easy to get around stuff and pierce into stuff, but not as easy as something like a straight back. It's a simple utilitarian blade shape. I will give them immense credit for slimming out the blade stock on this because, again, the 150,000th version of this, the one that was not the slim profile, as Anthony Scullambrini said, cut like a pool noodle. It was actually one of the worst performing knives that I have ever handled. I bought and sold that knife 3 or 4 different times because I kept thinking every one that I had gotten was a clunker. They weren't clunkers, it's just the basic version of this has bad blade geometry. This one, I would call the blade not an issue. The blade is good enough that it won't be a problem. There's nothing to praise about the blade, though. On to the action as we move from the blade to the handle. So action here, again, this is on bearings, and it is quite drop shutty. It's part of the reason that I think this might be Best Tech. It feels a bit like a Best Tech action. Definitely on bearings. Thumb stud only. Now, this thumb stud is a pokey boy. It is tall. It's got a little bit of that glow stuff, which is totally slick. So if you want to open this, you got to get down on the edge of the thumb stud like this and push it out. Now, a couple things to note right away. First off, this detent is strong. And that's not specific to this one. I didn't get a clunker. Every PDW, Prometheus Design Works, or Terrain 365 I've ever handled has had a very strong detent. This is no exception. It takes a lot of force to kick it out. Now, it fires out in a very satisfying way. Good acoustics, good action when you do break that detent, but it takes a decent bit of effort. And then the other problem is because this is a frame lock, if you put any pressure at all on this lock bar, if I grip it like this, so my thumb fingers on the lock bar, then I actually can't get it open. I've had that happen quite a bit where I've pulled this out of my pocket, accidentally gripped it in a way that puts pressure on the lock bar, and the thing just binds up. It's a problem that used to be much more common in knives 6-7 years ago. It's not one that I've experienced in a frame lock in quite a bit. So it's sort of taking me back in not necessarily a great way to get to experience that again. They do make this knife in a bolster lock version, where there is a bolster from about here back that covers most of that frame lock. From a functional perspective, that version is going to be better because most of the time, if your fingers are on that lock bar, it's going to be back in that area that would be covered by the bolster. And so it would take care of that binding up issue. You wouldn't have to worry about that. In this full frame lock version, it's a stiff detent all the time, and then if you put your fingers on the lock bar at all, it becomes a very stiff detent. And now, that brings us back to this thumb stud. So, it's easy to get purchased on the thumb stud. I will say one problem is this thumb stud is this line here is a little bit low. I would really, you can't do it with the blade shape, but I would almost prefer this thumb stud was like out like here instead of back here, because just with where I want to push this, the angle I'm pushing it at is not, you want that push to be perpendicular to the line between the pivot and the thumb stud. And if I crank my thumb around and make it perpendicular, it does fire a little easier, but just naturally holding this, you're pushing sort of toward the thumb stud. That doesn't give you the torque you really want around that axis. Combine that with the stiffer detent, and it just requires a lot of force to pop this out. Now, in some of my other reviews, I am generally a proponent of Chris Reeve thumb studs. A lot of people bitch about them. I don't. I don't find an issue with them at all. Yes, they're sharp. Yes, they're pointy, but it's easy enough to get your thumb in here and roll it out. That works for Chris Reeve because Chris Reeves don't have that strong of a detent. They've got that smooth hydraulic action, but at no point in this motion are you putting that much force on this thumb stud. So it's a little pointy, but it's not that bad. With this one, to break this detent requires quite a bit of force. Like here, I'm pushing pretty hard and I'm still not breaking the detent yet, and then it breaks. Because that detent is so strong, these pokey thumb studs are uncomfortable in a way that I'm not really used to. I am not the sort of person that's generally bothered by pokey thumb studs, and I'm still not bothered by this one, but I will say functionally, these are some of the least comfortable thumb studs that I have ever used on any knife. And again, it's been my experience with every other PDW or Terrain 365 knife I've handled. They're just, between the stiff detents and the pokey design of the thumb studs, they're just not pleasant to use. The closing action is great. Drop shutty on bearings as you would expect. No play, rock solid. But I like thumb stud actions quite a bit. It's my favorite way to open a knife, but these are some of my least favorite thumb studs that I have used. And especially when you consider how easy it is to pull this out of your pocket and put pressure on that lock bar, all considered, I don't love the action. So that's your blade, that's your action, onto the handle. I've already talked about how gorgeous this handle is. And this is full titanium. And the way they have lightly blasted this handle after the machining, and by the way, any imperfection you see here, this is, I was using in the garden. So there's some schmutz on here, but they blasted it after machining it, and it hides all your machine marks really well. You can see a couple of those machine marks if you look really closely in that choil. By the way, I went back to Bob Terzola's book. This can be called a choil. Like, this is not the only thing that's a choil. This can also be called a choil. But anyway, there's really cool little milling marks there, but the finish that is put on this, it doesn't attract fingerprints. It's smooth without being satiny. You've got a full backspacer here. It's just a very nicely finished handle, and it's a very visually interesting handle. The way this chamfer is mostly consistent, but then has some shorter points here, some shorter points here, big choil there, big chamfer up here. It's just cool to look at. But the problem comes when you start to use it. Brief digression to talk about neutral handles. So we've got 3 handle designs here. I keep bumping the camera today. A little out of practice. It's been a while since I've recorded one of these. Okay, we got 3 neutral handles, or 3 handles. You've got your Spyderco PM2, which is an example of what I call a highly opinionated handle. There's big curves, big scallops here, telling your hand exactly where it wants to be. It's really good in this grip. It's really good in this grip. And that's kind of where you can put your hands. You can pinch up stuff like that, but the PM2 tells you where you want to be. The CRK, Chris Reeves Sebenza, is a great example of a neutral handle. You can see there is no scallop in this handle that is telling me where it wants my hand to be. But what you'll see is that, especially when you look at these right next to each other, these aren't straight lines. There's not a straight line anywhere on the Sebenza. This whole thing is actually a gradual curve the whole way. This is a gradual curve the whole way. There's a curve here, there's curves here, variable radii everywhere. So when you grab this, even though it kind of looks like a stick, this sway goes into your palm, this sway goes into your pinky, and it ends up feeling very secure. It locks your hand into place without any big scallops. It's one of the brilliancies of the Sebenza's design, that it is a neutral handle that still locks your hand in place. Same sort of thing for another neutral handle design is very good. I've got my Atom here. There's a couple little choils and grooves here, but it's still a pretty neutral handle. But there's enough of a sway, enough curves here that, especially when you grab it up like this swell here goes right into your palm. This curve gives you purchase for a couple of your fingers. You can get into this front choil here. Your hand feels locked in, even without any big, bold curves. And this front groove right here gets a great place for your middle finger or pointer finger, depending on the grip. So even though I prefer strongly designed handles like the PM2 in general, there are neutral handle designs that I like. This is a bad neutral handle design from a ergonomic perspective. The problem with a neutral handle design, the problem that can emerge, is that when you've got something like the PM2, these curves hold your hand in place. They keep it from moving. If you don't have those curves like you do here, where you've got basically, these are very, very close to parallel lines. It actually tapers a little bit toward the butt, and you really see that if you look at how this milling line interacts with that chamfer. You can see it goes from about the midpoint toward the inside there. There's a slight taper toward the back, but there's no curves like you see. Here's a small Sabenza. There's no curves like you see on a Sabenza. There's no sort of, it's really just sort of the opposite. The Sabenza gets fatter toward the back, this gets thinner. With a neutral handle design like this, because the knife is not holding your hand in place, you have to hold the knife in place. Meaning, when I grab this knife, if I grab it like this, by the way, great front finger choil here. Really nicely knocked down, easy to hold. You combine that with the jimping, you've got a great pinch right here with your first two fingers. That's not an issue. But this is a pretty shallow choil here. This doesn't actually give my middle finger all that much purchase, or my pointer finger if I go in there. You can see this back lip just isn't quite enough. I can still, it gives me a little bit, but I can still move it around pretty easily. And then all of this back here, when I wrap my hand around it, it just kind of falls into my hand, and it doesn't feel secure. There is nothing holding this knife in place. It wants to rotate easily. It wants to move back and forth easily. And there's nothing in my palm here when I grip onto it. This knife just does not feel secure in the hand. There are no curves, there's no grooves, there's no traction, anything like that, that is keeping this knife secure. Actually, let me give one more comparison, because I feel like this is a point worth belaboring. Emerson A100. Very similar visual design, very similar overall design. I mean, the A100 is a stick. Now, Emerson, and I've got a bunch of Emerson reviews coming up because I'm back on my Emerson kick. Emerson has recognized, okay, my designs are a little bit neutral, so I'm going to use a bunch of giant jimping here. Most importantly, I'm going to use really textured G10 and a really thick handle design. And so even though this is neutral, this hand filling, the grip in my palm and on my fingers keeps in place. This knife is not going anywhere. I don't have to worry about feeling like it's going to move in my hand. The Invictus SP has nothing that gives me texture. This is all smooth titanium. I mean, these give me a little bit of texture, but only against twisting motion. It's not thick enough in the palm to sort of fill my palm. In that sense, the old Invictus was a little bit better in the hand than this one is. And then there's no curves of any sort that keep this knife in my hand. It just is not comfortable to hold. I use this to cut down a bunch of cardboard. And anytime I'm cutting cardboard with this, it feels like the knife wants to, when I'm cutting down, it feels like it wants to kick back. I have to grip harder to keep it in my hand and keep it pushing through the cut, whether I'm in this choked up grip or the choked back grip. When I use this in the garden, it was terrible in the sense that the second that I faced a tough root or anything like that, any resistance, I have to grip this knife so hard to feel like I have control over the blade. Because if I grip it lightly, it just feels squirrely. It feels like it wants to move around in my hand. Because there aren't any ergonomic lines that are keeping it in place. And then when you have to, either pinch up to try to do some detail cuts or go way back here, there's even less ergonomic, purchase. This knife, ergonomics wise, really shows some of the worst of neutral handle design for me, in that whatever I use this for, I felt like I had to hold onto the handle wasn't holding on to me. It sounds a little bit funny to say it that way, but when you compare that to ergonomically strong knives like your PM2, like your Sabenza, like pretty much anything from Hinderer or Emerson or anything like that, think about it. When you use those, you don't have to grip the knife that hard. You never have to worry about it coming out of your hand. This one I always did, and Basically, to summarize the ergonomic experience, anytime that I am reviewing knives, I carry multiple knives at once because I'm testing things, and I also want to have, usually I'll carry one that I'm familiar with and then a bunch that I'm testing, so I can keep doing sense checks and just sort of recalibrating in my head. So, I was carrying this one at the same time as this Atom, and I was carrying this at the same time as one of my PM2s, and I was carrying at the same time as a tactile Chupacabra, which, spoiler alert, is going to be is going to be one of my sort of standards going forward, because this thing is absolutely fantastic. But this, often when I'm doing a testing session, I'll come back to a knife a few times. I'll test it, I'll put it away, I'll try something else, I'll try it again. This thing, every single time I use it, whether it was in the garden, whether it was around the house, whether it was doing cardboard, I could not wait for the chance to go on to the next knife, because this thing was just unpleasant to use. I would use it, get frustrated, my hand would get more exhausted than it should for whatever task I was doing. I would move on, and then I would move on to the next knife as quickly as I could. And that's usually not my experience with knives, even ones that I don't like. I'll put them through their paces. This thing, I just did not like using at all. And the blade is fine. Again, the blade isn't good, but the blade isn't the problem. It's that this is just, while it looks great, ergonomically, I do not like this handle whatsoever. And I'm yet to find a single task that I like this for. The other fact is, you can get away with neutral handles in some designs that are meant for light use, like, now I don't love this knife, but this is a Serge Panchenko slip joint. This is his slip 5 or 7, I forget which one this is. Review coming up for this one. This is a lightweight slip joint. You can get away with a neutral handle here because you're not using this for anything hard. Now it's got slim blade stock, it's got a slicey design, it's a slip joint, it's meant for that, it's light. This thing, the blade isn't ground for it to be a slicer. Again, the blade isn't bad, but it's also not good. This isn't a lightweight knife. This isn't marketed as a lightweight knife. This isn't built as a lightweight knife. So I can't give it that pass here either. This is marketed and built as a more heavy-duty knife, and the handle just isn't up to snuff for that. Which brings us to fit, finish, and value. Fit and finish, and I think I've talked about that in a lot of the design details. It's really, really well done. There are so many interesting design details all the way throughout, and every single one of them is executed really well. Everything that's meant to be knocked down is knocked down properly. The finish on this blade is really, really cool and unique, as is the finish on the handle. This is a really nice light blast. The fullers are all really well done. You get none of that chatter you tend to get on the ends of fullers. The chamfers are all nice and even. The internal milling is well done. I mean, I love that cutout in the backspacer. I do not see many makers do that. The lanyard hole is completely invisible from the side. It's just a post here. The backspacer has more of that super functional jimping. It's cut really nicely. And by the way, little detail. So this backspacer here, the way it meets the handles. So a lot of makers, I don't have anything with a backspacer here. Actually, yes, I do. So let's look at the Chupacabra. And I actually haven't looked at this. I'm figuring this out live, but yeah. Okay, so you see how this is sort of a flat, they didn't chamfer that steel liner there. And so you can see the tolerance on the Chupacabra there. You can see how closely fit this super look is to the frame. And the tolerances on tactile are quite good. What I'm saying is basically you can look at where things meet and use that to see how tight your tolerances are. This has some pretty tight tolerances. You see it in the action, you see it in how well everything fits together. There's no big gaps or anything like that. But then look here. They chamfered the inside of the titanium, and then they even chamfered the edges of this backspacer, so you see those little chamfer marks meet right there. And rather than seeing, just a tiny little gap, you actually see the meeting of two chamfers at the edge of that backspacer. You see that elsewhere on the knife too. It's another just really good design detail that hides how tight or not tight their tolerances are and makes it just another sleek integrated design element. The way they do this clip that goes totally flush with the handle, it's cool. The way all these curves have similar radii, Even the way they cut that lock bar access there, that's not stepped, it's more mill lines that grab your finger, the amount of the internal milling. There is nothing about this knife that I don't like the way it's made. And there's no issue with the way it's made. It centers very nicely, and the fact is you can even see how nicely it's centered because of the way they cut that out. It's really well manufactured. And if that's sort of your question, is this well made? Absolutely. Price-wise, $350. $350. I'm 90% sure this is Chinese made from some OEM. I would guess Best Tech. That's at the higher end of the range. You're paying for Patrick Mall's design here. You're paying for a very distinctive design. I can't have that much of an issue with that given where the market is. I personally think it is ridiculous that in 2024, a Chinese-made frame lock on bearings should be twice the price of a paramilitary tube. Not actually twice the price, but like 1.75x the price. I think that is ridiculous. I think it is ridiculous that it should be almost twice the price of a TRM Atom in stock scales. But the fact is, that is where the market for Chinese knives is in 2024, and this is no more expensive than any of those other ridiculously priced frame locks on bearings that are coming out of China right now. So I'm not going to hold that against PDW. I'm not going to hold that against Terrain 365. The price is fine. The fit and finish is excellent for what you're getting. The design is completely distinctive. And I will say, the Terrain 365 versions of this knife, which again have literally the exact same design, they just have Teravantium instead of MagnaCut, I can justify the price on those a little bit more because they are using a patented steel. There are other dendritic cobalts out there. They're not the only ones doing it. Stellite 6K, all that sort of stuff. But they're the only player in town using that steel. That steel has some very interesting properties for certain people. It's completely corrosion resistant. It holds a toothy cutting edge for a very long time. There's lots to like there. It feels more justified for Terrain 365. For this one here, using MagnaCut, which is a better all-around steel, but certainly less distinctive. The fact is, at $350, you're paying for the design. The design is great. The fit and finish is good enough. I'm not going to complain about the price, but I'm not going to say that this is a great value at that price. It's fine. Which brings us to our overall conclusion. And the fact is, this is a design-first knife, and it feels like it. If I'm thinking about who to recommend this to, it really comes down to a simple question. Do you want a knife that looks really good, that looks good on Instagram, that looks good in your hand, that is cool? Or do you want a knife that is useful? If you're coming into this review and coming into this knife, and basically, if you're honest with yourself, your question is really, I love the way this knife looks. Is it at least good enough of a user that I won't hate using it? The answer, even then, is a qualified yes. I would never choose to use this knife again purely from a user perspective. This is one of my least favorite knives to use that I have used in quite a long time. It might be my least favorite knife to use that I have had on this channel so far, mostly because of the ergonomics of that handle. Again, the blade is good enough without being great, but there's nothing positive about the blade. It's just not a negative. But if you're not really using your knives all that much, this is well made. The thinner blade stock does it a ton of favors, and it is really cool. So if you're honest with yourself and that's the reason that you're buying it and you just want something that looks really cool, then yes, this looks really cool. It's made well enough, and with the thinner blade stock, it's okay. You won't hate yourself when you use it. You won't hate carrying this, and frankly, it'll do everything you need your knife to do. 7-8 years ago, this would have been considered a fine performer. And those knives were fine back then. For literally everybody else that is not in love with this design, at $350, there are so many better options on the market. Whatever you want a knife to do, there are better options to get it. If you want, like, honestly, and I know people love to bitch about Sebenza prices these days. Sebenza prices are not that high for your basic Sebenza. The fact is, if you're telling me, would I rather have this in $100 or this, it's not even a question. If you want a utility-focused knife that has a thumb stud opening, just get a Sebenza. Like, seriously, just get a Sebenza. If you want something that's sleek and is on bearings like this for around the same price, and you want something with that American heritage, I would say look at a Firetac, a Hinderer Firetac, before you look at this one. But the fact is, it's just, for whatever you want, there's nothing I like about the performance of this knife, and it's very, very hard to recommend this knife from any performance perspective and to anybody who cares about the performance of their knives. The ergonomics are really disappointing. The action is really frustrating. And the blade, while much better in this model than in the full thickness version, still is merely not bad. And so there's the additional caveat, which I'll bring back one more time. This blade is much more interesting in Terravantium. Because Terravantium is totally corrosion resistant, and because Terravantium does take that toothy edge for so long, I could deal with some of the ergonomic issues. Actually, even then, you got quiet carry. Now that I think about it, there's no reason, if you need a corrosion resistant blade, I don't even know why you would buy this over a quiet carry Waypoint, which happens to be cheaper and just as well made and has better jimping, and both of them are made overseas, and they might even be the same OEMs. I actually can't even think about why you would pick this over a Waypoint. It's a little bit thicker, but not even that much thicker, and the ergonomics are significantly worse. So no, as I talk through this, the Terravantium is interesting, and if you really like Terravantium, for $350, the Terravantium version might be worth looking at, but unless you're really into the hype, unless you really like the design, you really like Prometheus Design Works, this is a hard knife to recommend. I don't want to hate this knife as much as I do. I don't want to hate any knives quite as much as I do, but I wouldn't be much of a reviewer if I wasn't willing to say honestly when I have negative feelings about a knife. That would be a disservice to anybody who chooses to take the time to watch my videos. And I'm not going to moderate my opinion about this one, which is that it is aesthetically beautiful. The design is exceptional from a visual perspective. As basically an art piece, this is an extraordinarily well-designed knife, and there has been more thought and detail put into the visual design here than on just about anything else I've handled. But it is not a good knife. It is an art piece. It looks cool in the Instagram shots. You're not going to like using it. So I can't recommend this knife to pretty much anybody. And if you're one of the exceptions to that, you're going to know it, and you don't care how useful it is because that's not why you're buying it. That's my conclusion for the Prometheus Design Works Invictus SP. I will be selling this one soon, and this is, I think, my last hurrah with PDW. Again, I probably own 7 or 8 Prometheus Design Work or Terrain 365 designs over the last 3-4 years. I've sold all the previous ones. I wanted to give them one more shot, and this just brought back all the negative experiences I've had with them before, none of which come down to the manufacturing, even though some of the old ones did have play, this one doesn't. It's just, they don't provide what I'm looking for in a knife. That's it. This one ran a little long. Getting back into it. These reviews might be a little bit more periodic going forward, at least for the next couple months. We'll see. By the way, I make these reviews in batches. I'll record 4 or 5 in one sort of weekend day and then meter them out over the next few weeks. So it's been a little while since I recorded one. I'm recording a few of these today. So sort of getting back into it. Hope this was a good use of your time. Hope this gave you what you needed to understand whether this is the right knife for you or not. And I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you again soon.